It was 2 winters ago, during one of those bitterly cold nights where the chill cuts straight through you, no matter how many layers you're wearing. My buddy, Soren, and I decided to get away from the city and retreat into the Georgia woods for a bit of winter camping. We'd rented this small, rickety cabin deep in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no lights for miles, just trees, snow, and the occasional animal rustling around in the dark. Honestly, it seemed like the perfect way to unplug, even if it was colder than hell outside. By the time we got up to the cabin, it was around 6:30 p.m., and the temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling freeze. "God damn, it's cold," Elias said, clapping his gloved hands together as we stepped inside. I couldn't argue. My face felt like it had been frozen solid, and my boots were caked with snow. We lit a fire in the tiny wood-burning stove and cracked open the flask, sharing swigs as we warmed up. There's something about whiskey on a cold night that just hits different. By the time the fire was roaring, we were both feeling pretty good. Around 8 p.m., we decided to head outside and enjoy the night air with a couple of beers by the fire pit. The stars were out in full force, and the forest was dead silent. That's when we noticed her. Me. She came wandering over from the cabin next to ours, a bottle of wine in one hand and a big smile plastered on her face. "Hey, neighbors," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Mind if I join you?" Elias, being the social butterfly he is, welcomed her with open arms. I wasn't as quick to warm up. There was something about her. Maybe it was the way she was dressed, way too light for the freezing weather, or the way her eyes didn't quite match her smile. Still, she seemed friendly enough, so I didn't say anything. We ended up sitting by the fire, swapping stories and passing the bottle around. Evadne was flirty, real flirty. She kept laughing at Elias's dumb jokes and brushing her hand against my arm. At one point, she offered to grab more drinks from her cabin. "Why not?" Elias said with a grin. I didn't feel great about it, but I wasn't about to be the buzzkill, so I went along with it. Things took a turn when Elias got a little too drunk and started acting like an idiot. He knocked over one of the chairs, cursed up a storm, and generally made a scene. Evadne wasn't having it. "Maybe you should go back to your cabin and cool off," she said. Elias stumbled off, muttering something about how the fire wasn't that great anyway. That left me alone with Evadne, which, looking back, was my first mistake. She invited me back to her cabin, and against my better judgment, I went. The place was strange. It was way nicer than ours, cleaner, warmer, almost too perfect. But something about it felt off. There were no personal touches, no photos, no clutter. It looked more like a showroom than a place someone was actually staying in. And then there was the woman in the corner. She was sitting in a chair, her face partially obscured by a wig, staring at the floor. Evadne acted like she wasn't even there. "Who's that?" I asked. "Oh, don't worry about her," Evadne said with a laugh, waving it off like it was no big deal. "She's just a friend." Yeah, right. My gut was screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but I didn't want to come off as rude. So I stayed. Evadne poured me another drink, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. She kept glancing at the woman in the corner and then back at me, like she was waiting for something. That's when I overheard her on the phone. She had stepped into the kitchen, but her voice carried. "Yeah, he's here," she said in a low tone. "I'll keep him busy." My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. What the hell was going on? I needed to leave, and fast. I made up some excuse about needing to use the bathroom and locked the door behind me. My mind was racing. There was no way I was walking out of that cabin the normal way. I opened the bathroom window and climbed out as quietly as I could and landed in the snow with a soft thud. I sprinted back to our cabin, slipping and sliding through the snow. Elias was sitting on the porch, still looking pissed off about being kicked out. "We need to go. Now," I said, grabbing his arm. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, his words slurring slightly. "Evan, she's not right. Something's off. Just trust me." "Elias, Thankfully, didn't argue. We grabbed our bags and took off down the trail, not even bothering to lock the cabin behind us. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and every snap of a branch made me jump. We finally made it to a gas station about 2 miles away and called a taxi. I didn't stop shaking until we were back in town. A few days later, I did some digging and found out that the cabin Evadne had been staying in wasn't even hers. It was a rental, just like ours, but there was no record of her or anyone else booking at that. Weak. To this day, I have no idea what her deal was or what would have happened if I'd stayed. But one thing's for sure, I'm a hell of a lot more cautious now. Camping and hiking. I'm not giving those up. You better believe I'm packing a knife and trusting my gut from here on out. Some people, man, you just never know. It was a bitterly cold December morning when I decided for solo winter camping trip. Specifically, I'd planned to cover the section near Max Patch, a gorgeous bald summit in North Carolina, known for its panoramic views. The plan was ambitious, a 12-mile trek that would take me deep into the Pisgah National Forest, where the trail winds through dense, snow-laden woods. I'd been itching for solitude and a break from the grind, but damn, I didn't realize how much the cold would bite. I parked my car at the trailhead just off Max Patch Road around 7:30 a.m. The frost on the windshield was so thick it took me a solid 10 minutes to scrape it off, and even then, my fingers were numb. Why the hell am I doing this again? I muttered, shoving my gloves on and double-checking my gear. The temperature hovered around 18 Fahrenheit, and a light snow had started to fall, covering the trail in a fresh layer of powder. It was beautiful, sure, but also a reminder that I was trekking into some serious cold. By 8:15 a.m., I was on the trail, my breath puffing out in little clouds. The first couple of miles were steady, a gentle incline through a forest of towering pines. The silence was eerie, broken only by the crunch of snow under my boots. I'd read about the isolation of this section of the trail, but experiencing it was a whole other beast. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. Get a grip, oh girl, I muttered to myself, pulling my scarf tighter against the wind. But as I covered more ground, the feeling didn't go away. Around 10 a.m., as I approached a clearing about 5 miles in, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around, squinting into the trees. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the wind stirring the branches. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, shaking my head. But as I started walking again, the footsteps resumed, always keeping pace with mine. I was nearing the halfway point of my hike and decided to stop for lunch at a small clearing near a frozen creek. Sitting on a log, I pulled out a thermos of coffee and a peanut butter sandwich. "This is living the dream, huh?" I said aloud, trying to laugh at the situation. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. As I packed up to continue, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone, a figure dressed in dark clothing, slipped between the trees about 50 yards away. My stomach dropped. "What the hell?" I whispered, gripping my trekking poles like they were weapons. I stared at the spot where I'd seen the figure, but they were gone. My brain raced. Was it another hiker? Maybe. But why were they staying out of sight? I decided to pick up the pace. By 1 p.m., I'd covered another 3 miles, but the unease had only grown stronger. The footsteps behind me were more frequent now, and every time I turned around, there was no one there. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "This is insane," I muttered. "You're just imagining things." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone was following me, and they were doing a damn good job of staying hidden. By 2 p.m., the sun was starting to dip lower. I knew I needed to find a safe spot to camp soon, but the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. As I rounded a bend, I saw him again, a man, standing about 30 yards off the trail. He was wearing a dark coat and a beanie, his face partially obscured by the trees. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "What do you want?" He didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment before slipping back into the woods. "Oh, hell, no," I said, adrenaline surging through me. I started walking faster, practically jogging, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if he had a weapon? What if he was waiting for me to camp so he could... I didn't even want to finish that thought. Just as the light was beginning to fade, I spotted a park ranger up ahead near a trail junction. I practically ran up to him, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "There's someone following me," I said, pointing back down the trail. "I've seen him a couple of times, and he's creeping me the hell out." The ranger, a burly guy with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded grimly. "There's been reports of a man acting suspiciously in the area. Let's get you to a shelter." He led me about half a mile off the main trail, to a small wooden shelter tucked into a grove of trees. As we walked, he kept scanning the woods, one hand resting on the radio clipped to his vest. "Stay here," he said once we reached the shelter. "I'm going to check the area." Sitting in that shelter, every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire. I clutched my trekking poles, jumping at every sound. When the ranger returned about 30 minutes later, he confirmed what I had suspected. The man had been following me. He'd seen footprints in the snow and spotted the guy lingering near the trail. "We didn't catch him," the ranger said, "but we'll keep an eye out. You're safe here for the night." The next morning, I packed up and hiked back to my car as fast as my legs would carry me. Would I stop camping and hiking? Hell no. But I'd learned from that point on. I made damn sure to always carry a pocket knife and be a whole lot more cautious. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I answer with a sharper eye and a better sense of awareness. It had been years since I'd seen my cousin Kate. Life had its way of pulling us apart, but that winter in 2016, we finally decided to change that. Kate called me out of the blue, her voice just as sharp and full of fire as I remembered. "Arabella, it's time. Let's go camping," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world to suggest trekking through the freezing wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. "Camping? In the middle of winter?" I asked, practically choking on my coffee. "Are you insane? That's how people end up on those true crime podcasts." Kate laughed, but it wasn't a suggestion, it was a challenge. And hell, I wasn't about to let her think I was scared of a little cold. So, a week later, I found myself staring at her outside a diner in Asheville, North Carolina, hugging her tight like we hadn't spent the last few years living separate lives. "Damn, you haven't changed a bit," I said, looking at her messy hair and that same worn-out jacket she always loved. "Neither have you," she shot back, smirking. "Except maybe for those wrinkles around your eyes. Life treating you rough." "Oh, screw you," I laughed, shoving her playfully. "Now, tell me where you're dragging me. This better be worth it." Kate grinned, pulling out a map. "We're heading about 40 miles east of here, to a spot near Roan Mountain. The views are killer, and it's so remote you'll forget the rest of the world exists. You're seriously selling this with isolation and freezing temperatures?" I rolled my eyes, but grabbed my bag anyway. Deep down, I was excited not for the cold, but for the chance to reconnect. The first couple of days were, dare I say it, perfect. The snow crunched under our boots as we hiked through trails framed by frost-coated trees. We spent hours exploring frozen streams and snapping pictures of the winter landscape. Kate even convinced me to try snowshoeing, and by convinced, I mean she wouldn't shut up about it until I gave in. "Come on, Bella, where's your sense of adventure?" she teased. "Oh, it's here," I shot back, buried under 6 layers of clothing because it's 20 freaking degrees out. But I'll admit, there was something magical about those quiet, snow-covered woods. Even when we weren't talking, it felt like we were repairing something that had been broken for too long. And the locals we met in a nearby town added to the charm, sharing stories of mountain legends and warning us about the unpredictable weather. "You girls be careful," one old-timer said. "These woods have seen their fair share of trouble." Kate and I just laughed it off. "Trouble?" Us? No way. By the third night, though, I started to rethink everything. We'd spent the afternoon trekking down to a creek, a mile from our campsite, where Kate decided she wanted to try get this ice fishing. Kate, for the love of God, it's getting dark, I complained, shivering as I stood by the bank. 5 more minutes, she said, crouched over the hole she drilled in the ice like a damn professional. Go back to the fire if you're cold. So I did. Back at camp, the fire was crackling, and for a while I felt at peace. But then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. At first, I thought it was Kate, but the steps were too heavy. Kate, I called out, my voice trembling just a bit. No answer. Then, out of nowhere, 2 figures stepped into the firelight, their faces obscured by masks. What the hell? I stammered, standing up so fast I nearly tripped. Before I could do anything, one of them lunged at me, swinging a wooden staff. Pain exploded in my shoulder, and I screamed, falling backward. Oh my God, get away from me. The second figure hurled a rock that caught me square in the ribs. Hey, leave her alone, you bastards. She came charging in like a damn warrior, wielding the fishing pole she'd been so obsessed with. But it didn't matter. They were stronger, and there were 2 of them. We fought, we screamed, but in the end, they overpowered us, tying us up while they ransacked the campsite. You've got to be kidding me, Kate spat as they rifled through our gear. You're stealing from a couple of broke campers? Real classy. They didn't say a word, just kept taking phones, laptops, wallets, anything valuable. When they finally left, disappearing into the woods like ghosts, we were bloodied, bruised, and terrified. It felt like hours before help arrived. Some hikers had heard the commotion and found us, untangling the ropes and helping us to our feet. One guy, a burly man named Tom, took one look at us and said, Jesus Christ, what happened here? We got jumped, Kate said bluntly, wincing as she held her side. A couple of bastards came out of nowhere. They helped us back to town, where we got patched up at the local clinic. The police took our statements, but we knew it was useless. The attackers were long gone, and in a place as vast as the Appalachians, finding them was like finding a needle in a haystack. Yeah, a story that ends with me saying never again. I shot back, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't mean it. The mountains still called to me, even after all that. Maybe I'd go back one day, but next time, I'd be ready for anything. It was the middle of January, and we were all itching for something exciting, something that didn't involve scrolling through our phones or hanging out at the same boring spots in town. Me, Jake, Maribel, Ethan, and Zoe were all under 20, dumb enough to think we were invincible, and bored out of our minds. That's how we ended up planning a winter camping trip. Specifically, we decided on a trail near Blood Mountain, Georgia, a name that already should have been a red flag. But hell, we weren't looking for safe. We wanted crazy. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was about 2:30 p.m. The snow was coming down lightly, dusting the trees and covering the trail in a soft, powdery white. We'd packed up our gear, tents, sleeping bags, a ridiculous amount of snacks, and of course, a couple of bottles of whiskey. The plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles in, set up camp, and just let loose for the night. Things started off great. The first couple of miles were easy enough, even with the snow crunching underfoot. We laughed, we drank, we slipped on icy patches and cursed the hell out of the cold. By the time we hit mile 3, though, the forest started to feel. The trees seemed denser. That's just the wilderness, man, Jake said when I mentioned it. It's supposed to be creepy. He flashed me that cocky grin of his, the one that always made you feel like you were being stupid for worrying. Around 5 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set, we stumbled across the cabin. It was tucked off the trail, barely visible through the trees. The cabin looked ancient, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, the windows frosted over and cracked. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Holy shit, this is it, Ethan said, his eyes lighting up. We've got to check this out. Hell no, Zoe shot back. That thing looks like it's held together with duct tape and prayers. Come on, it's just a cabin, Jake said, already walking toward it. What's the worst that could happen? We all hesitated, standing there in the snow, staring at the cabin like it might bite us. Then Jake, being Jake, started talking shit. What's wrong? Y'all scared? I'll go in first, show you how it's done. That was all it took. Nobody wanted to be the chicken, so we followed him, joking about who was braver as we approached the door. Inside, the air was colder than outside, like the place was sucking the heat right out of us. Everything smelled damp and rotten, like the forest had been slowly reclaiming the place. Damn, it's creepy as hell in here, Maribel whispered. She was clutching her phone like it was a lifeline, even though there wasn't a single bar of service this deep in the woods. Yo, check this out, Ethan said, shining his flashlight at the far wall. Strange symbols were carved into the wood circles, triangles, things that looked like eyes. They were rough, like someone had scratched them in with a knife. None of us said anything for a second. It was like the air had gotten heavier, pressing down on us. Jake wandered into the next room, and we all followed like sheep. It was smaller, with a cracked window that let in a bitter draft. There was a dark stain on the floor, almost black, and it didn't take a genius to figure out what it was. Is that blood? Maribel asked, her voice shaking. Nah, Jake said, but he didn't sound so sure. Probably. I don't know. Paint or something. Yeah, 'cause people come out to the middle of nowhere to do arts and crafts, Zoe shot back. Let's get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps. We were about to leave when Maribel screamed. Not a little yelp of full-on, blood-curdling scream that made my heart feel like it was going to explode. I spun around, my flashlight swinging, wildly, and saw her pointing at the ceiling. I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a dark figure, hanging upside down like a bat. Its arms were twisted at unnatural angles, and its head lolled to the side like it was broken. The face, or what was left of it, was pale and hollow, with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right through us. Holy shit, what the hell is that? Ethan yelled, grabbing Maribel and pulling her toward the door. We didn't stick around to find out. We bolted, tripping over each other in our rush to get the hell out of that cabin. By the time we made it outside, the snow was falling harder, and the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. We didn't stop running until we hit the trail, our breaths coming out in ragged gasps. Is everyone okay? I asked. Everyone nodded, but Maribel was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. She didn't say a word the whole way back. It was past 9 p.m. by the time we made it back to the trailhead and piled into Jake's beat-up truck. Nobody said much during the drive back to town. The next day, Maribel got sick. Like, really sick. She was burning up with a fever, muttering nonsense about shadows and eyes watching her. Her parents took her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. She got better after a few days, but she was never the same. She wouldn't talk about what happened at the cabin, and every time someone brought it up, she'd just shake her head and say, "We shouldn't have gone in there." As for the rest of us, we never went back to that trail. Hell, I haven't been camping since. I still think about that night, though, about the cabin and whatever the hell we saw hanging from that ceiling. It was 3 years ago, but the memory of that night still burns in my mind like a bad dream I can't shake. Back then, I was just 16, reckless as hell, and hungry for any thrill I could find. It was me, Zeke, and Deacon, my two partners in crime. We weren't bad kids, exactly, but we had a knack for finding trouble, and that bitterly cold January night on the deep woods was no exception. The plan had been set. Earlier that week, Deacon had stumbled across an old, overgrown trail deep in the Nantahala National Forest, near standing Indian Mountain. The snow blanketed everything so heavily it looked untouched. Deacon had sworn up and down it would be the perfect place to camp, far from anyone who might care if we got loud or built a fire. At the time, it sounded like a killer idea. We set out just before sundown, our breath visible in the freezing air as we trudged through the snow. The trailhead was about 12 miles from the nearest town, and we had to park Zeke's old Chevy at a pull-off and hike the rest of the way in. It was probably a mile and a half to the spot Deacon had scouted, but in the snow, it felt like 10. By the time we reached the clearing he'd found, it was pitch dark. The temperature had dropped into the teens, and I couldn't feel my damn toes. We set up camp just off the trail, in a small patch of flat ground surrounded by towering pines. Deacon started a fire in an old metal barrel he'd found nearby, and Zeke broke out the cheap beer we'd swiped from his dad's garage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make the cold a little more bearable. We were laughing, talking crap about school and daring each other to eat snow, until we noticed something that made us all go quiet. Across the clearing, half hidden in the shadow of some bushes, was an old, beat-up truck. The thing looked like it hadn't moved in years. Its gray paint was peeling. The tires were partially buried in the snow, and the headlights were glowing but very dim, which didn't make a damn bit of sense. Zeke, being Zeke, immediately wanted to go check it out, but something about it felt wrong. "It's probably just some old hunter's truck," Deacon said, tossing a stick into the fire. "What's the big deal?" "Yeah," Zeke chimed in. "Unless you're scared, Salem. You scared of a rusty old truck?" "Hell, no," I shot back, even though I absolutely was. "But maybe let's not go poking around someone else's crap." We argued for a bit, but in the end, we left the truck alone. For a while, it was fine. We warmed up by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. Then, around 10:30 p.m., just as we were starting to settle in, the peace shattered. An alarm went off, loud and shrill. It was coming from the direction of the truck. We all froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell?" Zeke muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. Before any of us could move, we heard the crunch of snow under heavy boots. A man stepped into the firelight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a scowl that could curdle milk. His breath came out in angry puffs, and his eyes darted between the three of us. "You little shits mess with my truck," he barked. "No!" I blurted out, holding up my hands. "We didn't touch it, I swear." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, taking a step closer. "I've been watching you kids." That sent a chill down my spine, colder than the winter air. "Watching us? Since when?" Deacon tried to reason with him, but the guy wasn't having it. He started circling the fire, his eyes scanning our stuff like he was looking for an excuse to lose it. "You punks think you can just come out here and mess with my property? You got another thing coming." Zeke, always the hothead, couldn't keep his mouth shut. "Look, man, we didn't touch your stupid truck. Why don't you just Zeke?" I cut him off, but it was too late. The man's face twisted with rage, and he lunged toward Zeke. That's when everything went to hell. In the heat of the moment, Aaron grabbed one of the empty beer bottles and swung it at the guy's head. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man went down. For a second, none of us moved. Then the guy groaned, and all hell broke loose. "Run," Deacon shouted, and we took off into the woods, leaving our gear and the fire behind. The snow was knee-deep, and every step felt like wading through quicksand. I didn't dare look back, convinced I'd see that guy right on our heels. "We need to keep moving," Deacon said, his voice shaking. "If he wakes up and comes after us, if—" Zeke interrupted, his face pale. "You think he's just gonna let this slide? We're screwed, man." He wasn't wrong. We stumbled through the woods for another hour before we finally found the trailhead. When we got home, we didn't even bother unpacking. We just sat in Zeke's basement, too shaken to do anything but stare at the floor. The next day, Deacon went back to grab our stuff, but most of it was gone. The fire had burned out, and the truck was nowhere to be seen. I don't know who that guy was or what he wanted. That night changed all of us. Deacon stopped going on those wild adventures. Zeke started carrying a knife everywhere, and me? I still love the woods, but I'm not stupid anymore. You won't catch me out there without a plan, and maybe a little backup.